All right. So the absolutely most popular way for collecting data in all of psychology and definitely within human sexuality would be surveys. We love a good survey in psychology, that is for sure. Now, there are different ways to administer surveys. The sort of old-fashioned, classical way to approach would be to do a written questionnaire. And we call it a written questionnaire if you actually are sitting there with a piece of paper and a pen or pencil and you're writing, numbers, right? Like you guys are probably taking scales where you're asked on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree with this statement or whatever? So you could be answering, marking numbers, you could be checking boxes, whatever. It's on a piece of paper and a pencil, and then we call it written. Interviews would be where you either sit face to face with the participant and the interviewer, or it could be a telephone interview. And the big difference between interviews and written questionnaires is that it's done orally. So the interviewer asks a question, the respondent gives their answer, and the interviewer either writes down notes or they're recording the conversation or something like that, of course, with the permission of the respondent. The final kind is internet surveys, which generally look a lot like a written questionnaire. It's just that you do it using your fingers or the mouse or whatever to click your responses. Sometimes there will be open-ended questions like an interview, but you type your answers in. So there's no face-to-face component or even a voice that you're interacting with like you would in an interview. It's just you and the computer screen. So if surveys are the most popular method, the internet survey has absolutely become the most popular method. Since COVID, we've been just doing completely online research, and it's amazing how how many people have suddenly been initiating new research studies because they're like, hey, you know what? I can use SurveyMonkey. Let's go ahead and do some research. It's definitely an easy way to administer a survey. You can just provide a URL to the survey for your participants, and they don't have to see you. They can be completely confident that it's anonymous. There's no way to tie their responses back to them. So some people argue that they might be more honest. But there is the problem, and I've really been struggling with this one. There are two main problems I've been struggling with. One is that I don't know who's actually completing the survey. And so it's possible that a person, sometimes people like to mess with researchers, and please, if you participate in my research, don't do this to me, okay? But they'll like to mess with researchers, and they'll say that they're, the other sex, or they'll say that they're a different age than they are, or they'll say the opposite of what they really think on each of the questions, or things like that. And you never know what's going on with a respondent when you can't see them. And so that's problematic. I've done the exact same study face-to-face using a written questionnaire versus having it be online. And I've found that I'm actually getting more honest answers in the online version. So I do like that, I have to say. So I'm willing to sacrifice I'm not sure that the person is who they say they are for the fact that they're probably giving me better answers. But the other thing that is problematic with internet surveys is that people will start the survey, and I get this a lot. I'll look at my survey, I'll be like, wow, I've got 250 respondents. Then when I go in and I look at the data, I see that 50 of the responses are actually people started it and then they quit and didn't finish the whole survey. And then I'm never sure if this individual actually came back and completed the survey, or if I just lost that participant. You know what I mean? Like I don't know what to do with those incompletes. And that's kind of a problem. And I'm not exactly sure. We're going to have to come up with something in psychology to deal with those incompletes. Because do I say that I had 250 participants and 50 of them were incomplete? Or do I say I had 200 participants and that's it, and I ignore those 50 that were incomplete? It's difficult. So the internet has made it easier / more complicated. So, all right. Now let's talk about some famous surveys. The Kinsey Reports were like the first human sexuality surveys. I am unaware of anything that was earlier than Kinsey. So here's a picture of Alfred Kinsey. I literally just scoured the internet trying to find a picture that did not make him look bad. And this is the best I came up with. Poor dude. He looks just a little tired or something. I don't know. Anyway, in 1948, he published the results of surveys that he had been doing for probably the previous 5 years of men. And so in 1948, he published this book called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. And then in 1953, he published its companion piece, which was Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. And these were both based on really extensive surveys of the human male and the human female, surprisingly enough. And so he and his group went and interviewed a bunch of men, a bunch of women, and got their attitudes about sex, their sexual histories, all sorts of, at the time, what was considered very inappropriate questions, right? That today we would probably answer without blinking an eye. But back then it was quite surprising. And in fact, there was a book published in 1953 called, Oh, Dr. Kinsey. And it was a photo collection of people reacting to reading the Kinsey Report. So it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe people said this. And then they took pictures of them as they were reacting, sort of like, modern reaction videos on YouTube, but it was just 70 years ago. So, Dr. Kinsey came out of that, and he actually was named Times Man of the Year in 1953 after he produced these two stories. So he really initiated the idea of asking people open-ended questions about their, experiences, also some closed-ended, did you do this, that, or this, kinds of questions, and then compiled them together into these books. He was actually a biologist. I think he was a zoologist by training, not a psychologist. And a lot of people have spent a lot of time kind of trying to disparage his motives and, who he was as a person and other things. I'm not exactly sure what the goal of that is, but we'll talk a little bit more about some of that stuff later. But, he definitely was the first person to try and scientifically quantify some of the issues that had to do with human sexual behavior. Now, when we talk about surveys, there are a lot of things that researchers are very concerned about, and we want to make sure that our surveys, the ones that we use, have the best structure and, are as valid as they can be and things like that. So one of the things you'll notice on your self-assessments is I oftentimes ask you about the wording of the questions because, sometimes surveys can have problematic questions in them. Here's an example. 2 different opinion polls. One asked, should abortion be prohibited? And the other asked, should the life of an unborn baby be protected? So these are both opinion polls. These weren't research questions. These were opinion questions. But the opinion houses, I think one was Gallup and the other was Roper, if I recall correctly. Both of these houses said that they were asking about whether people thought that abortion should be prohibited. But I think we can agree that only one of them actually asked that question, right? The other one asked a much more complicated question that includes a lot of other things besides abortion, right? Should the life of an unborn baby be protected? That includes things like, education about prenatal vitamins or prenatal care or seatbelt wearing while pregnant or a whole bunch of things, not drinking while pregnant, things like that, right? I mean, there are a lot of things included in that second question. So we shouldn't be surprised. I thought I had I guess not. We shouldn't be really surprised if we find that more people agreed with the second statement. About 20% more people agreed with the second statement than had agreed with the first statement. Now, these were 2 different research houses, so this is what we call a between subjects comparison. It was not the same respondents who responded to both of these questions. So one group was asked, should abortion be prohibited? The other group was asked, should the life of an unborn baby be protected? And about 20% more people agreed with the second statement than had agreed with that first statement. Now, there are a couple of things about the wording. So one of them is obviously there's a different meaning to that second question that includes a lot of other things. But there's also something embedded in that first question that actually is what we call inflammatory language. And it's probably not what you might be thinking. A lot of times people think, well, the inflammatory word is abortion, but it turns out the inflammatory word is prohibited. In lots of different studies of survey question wording. It has been consistently found that at least Americans, I cannot speak for all cultures because we just don't have the data on it, but within the US, people do not like words such as prohibited, limited, denied. Those kinds of negative words tend to make people disagree with the statement. A lot of times people would say things like, well, I wouldn't do it, but I think others should be allowed to make their own decision. So when you have prohibited, it makes people go, whoa, 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 whoa. No, right? Whereas protected, it's a different kind of inflammatory language where it's the kind of thing that makes people want to do it. And so people are much more likely, no matter what the subject matter is, to agree to something that is going to protect and disagree with something that's going to prohibit. So we end up with the, different number of people agreeing to the second statement, in part because of, the way it's written, but also because of the inflammatory language in that first one. How about this question? This was a legitimate question on a survey. People grow up in all types of families. What type of family did you grow up in? Mom as a single parent? Dad as a single parent? Both mom and dad? There's only 3 family structures in the world. I did not know that. So how do you answer if you weren't raised in one of these 3 structures? I mean, at the minimum, you've got mom as a single parent. Mom can never be married or remarried. So there's never a stepfather in the situation or stepmother in the situation. I mean, at the minimum. Then we have what about 2 dads or 2 moms, right? That's been a family structure that's been sanctioned by law for at least 20 years adoption in gay couples has been legal in most states for about 20 years. It's not that abnormal. Why is that not on the list? And I use the word abnormal, which means it's not that atypical. It's not unheard of. What about people who were raised by their grandparents or an aunt or an uncle, or who was adopted, and so they might be thinking, this sounds like biological parents? Well, there's just so many. This is a survey wording where it's like you need to have one of these structures or else your view is not going to be accurately represented. And so what happens when people are confronted with something that doesn't represent their actual experience is that they might leave this item blank. They're like, well, I wasn't raised in any of these. And so they might leave it blank. And then now you have incomplete data and you're drawing incorrect conclusions, right? So maybe you go, well, I'll only analyze the people who answered all of my questions. And so anybody who left this blank is going to be left out. And now there might be something systematically different about the people who left this blank and were left out of the analysis versus those who answered this question. All right. Here's another wording issue. Which do you prefer to use? Now, the actual survey asked, which do you prefer, tennis or soccer? So I went ahead and just substituted something more sexually related just to illustrate the point. So which do you prefer to use, condoms or birth control pills? Or another group being asked, which do you prefer, birth controls or condoms? In the original study, one group was asked, which do you prefer, tennis or soccer? And another group was asked, what do you prefer, soccer or tennis? So the idea is it's just switching the order. Many more substantial number of people preferred birth control pills in the first example, or in that case, it was actually soccer, and condoms in the second case, or it was tennis in the original study. The idea being whichever one came last is what people prefer. Now in the original study, it's possible, I guess, that like all the soccer lovers were in one sample and all the tennis lovers were in the other, but that seems like a really complex explanation for the pattern of the data. It's a lot easier to say that when you got this, you have the same virtual number of people agreeing that soccer is better as tennis, as long as it was in the second position, you have to come to the conclusion that it was the order that determined their judgment, not the actual content. So they were just agreeing with whatever came last. And it was like a 2/3 majority that picked the thing that came last. And so we have to be really careful. Now, what I displayed here is what we do in research. Half of the participants will see it in one order and half of the participants will see it in the other order, so that hopefully order effects will cancel each other out and we'll actually be able to display the pattern of preference. So yeah, the wording, that would be included in it, right? Word order. All right. So I talked about generalization earlier. What we're doing in surveys is that we need to select a sample from the population that will allow us to generalize back to that population. So we need to make sure that our sample is large enough, for one thing, but it can't be so large that you might as well have just polled the population, right? It's going to be worth your while to sample. And generally what we're looking at is 500 people or less in our sample. Now that might sound, did you mean to say less or did you mean to say more? No, I literally meant less. Generally, if we're going to be conducting a survey, we're going to then conduct what are called inferential statistics. And inferential statistics are the more complicated statistics that allow us to generalize to the population. If you have too large of a sample, your inferential statistics actually lose their ability to correctly distinguish non-differences. Like if the groups responded exactly the same, we want to know that. And our inferential statistics might say that they're different from each other when they really aren't. So we want a sample that is large enough. Now, what's large enough? Well, it depends. It depends on how many questions you're asking them. So generally, the rule of thumb is you want about 5 respondents for each item on the survey. So if you're administering a really long survey, you might get up to more than 500 participants using my little rule of thumb. So you would want to say 5 participants per item with no more than 500 and no fewer probably than 100, probably. That's a good rule of thumb for just getting started. So you want to make sure that you have a sample that's the right size. Now, ideally with a survey, you'll achieve that sampling through what's called random sampling, where every member of the population has an equal chance of being included in the sample. That's pretty tough to actually accomplish, right? It sounds simple. Oh, I'll just randomly select. But remember a couple of lectures ago, I mentioned we're not allowed to just sort of kidnap people and make them participate. So we can offer them to participate. We can ask them to participate, but they can refuse. And that's where we start to get into trouble. So we start off with random sampling, and then we don't necessarily end up with a random sample. The idea of a random sample is that if we give everybody in the population an equal chance of participating, then we will end up with a sample that looks like the population, right? Like that's the goal. We want our sample to be like a little subset of the population and correctly represent it. But we can have that volunteer bias that can cause some people to agree to participate and others to refuse, and we end up with misleading information. So I'm going to just emphasize we do the best we can, right? I have never randomly sampled on any of the surveys that I do. I just include everybody who's willing to do it. I just go, hey, are you willing to do my survey? Great. Hey, do you have any friends or family you'd like to pass this URL to? Like, just let's get everybody who's willing to do this to do it. And generally, I have never gotten up to 500 respondents. And I don't know how well we're representing the population, but this is like, it's difficult to recruit participants that, in a random way. It's really difficult because of that self-selection bias. Right? The fact that they can say yes or they can say no. Just recently, like 2 days ago, Sunday. So not to pin myself down to what the date is right now too hard, but just recently, a researcher named well, she wasn't really we'll call her a researcher named Cher Height, died. And she had become famous for a study that she did back in 1973. And she was, I don't know, famous or infamous is the word we want to use. She published something called the Height Reports. We're going to talk about this more in another context too. But what I wanted to emphasize here is her random sampling technique. So she sent her survey out to a random sample of 6,000 potential participants. And she used, this was 1973, so she used just sort of a random address generator. Believe it or not, we actually had little computers and things like big computers, entire rooms full of computers that could do things like assign a number to everybody who's in the phone book and then randomly decide what numbers are the important ones. And that's how you decide who will be in your sample. So she followed the normal randomization protocol to decide who to invite to be in the survey. And she sent it out to 6,000 people. Okay, so that's a lot. If you're just going to be doing descriptive statistics, it's probably fine. If you're just going to be like computing averages and percentages and things like that, it's probably fine to have that many. So that's probably good. I'm okay with it. It's just if you're going to do inferential statistics, you don't want to have that many. But so she sends it out to 6,000 participants. And don't worry, she didn't get 6,000 anyway. She received 2% of those surveys back. It's like, that's nothing. 2%. Today we say that you want to have at least 60% of them come back in order for you to be confident that your random sampling actually worked. Personally, I'm a pretty rigid researcher, and I would say it needs to be at least 80% of them came back, or I'm going to consider it a failure. Like I didn't get enough responses. I mean, at the minimum, I'm going to have to say I didn't do random sampling. I'm going to have to say, this is completely self-selection bias that we're just experiencing here, and we're just going to have to take it with a grain of salt. But what she did instead is, instead of publishing it in the scientific literature, she published a book and called it the Height Report, and reported that of the 120 people that she surveyed, these are the things that they said. And that's all great, except for that she didn't survey 120 people. She surveyed 6,000, but only got 120 responses. So she should have acknowledged that it was garbage, because it was garbage. And I'll just give you a quickie insight into how we know it's garbage. What are the questions? Okay, first off, she sends out this manila envelope full of like a lot of pages of a survey to these randomly selected people. And I think she had a return address that was associated with the Playboy industry, because that was who was financing her research. So imagine you're a 1973 adult and you have received a manila envelope from the Playboy industries, and you're like, what is that? There's a high probability you might have just thrown it away, right? Because you're like, I don't subscribe to Playboy. I don't approve of Playboy. I want nothing to do with Playboy. So you throw it away. Of the people who are willing to open it and look inside, they find an survey that is comprised of what we call open-ended questions. So the questions included things such as, tell me about your first sexual experience. So it's like you're supposed to write your little essay about your first sexual experience. So again, imagine you're a 1973 adult and you're being asked to describe in your own words your sexual experiences or thoughts or attitudes or whatever. I don't know how well you are familiar with 1973, but if you were, let's say, 40 in 1973, you were born in 1923. I'm going to say it's probably against your social mores to, answer these kinds of questions. You don't know where it's really going, stuff like that. So there's probably a big subsample that threw them away once they saw what the questions were. Then there was probably a number of people who maybe thought it was kind of interesting and started to fill it out. But man, open-ended questions for like 10 pages, that's a lot. And so there were probably a lot of people who didn't finish it, who might have been interested. And maybe if it had been a different style of survey, might have responded, but never got it back. And then there were probably people who completed it and, were preparing to send it back, but just never got around to it, whatever. So when we're down to the 2% who actually responded, we have to take with a grain of salt the fact that she reported that 80% of the male respondents said that they had had extramarital affairs. Now that's 4 times any other survey the rate of extramarital affairs. So we have to say, everybody else hovers somewhere around 20% and she's got 80%. I'm going to have to say hers is the faulty data. And, if you think about it, maybe people were more willing to respond if they had like a confession to get off their chest, right? Like maybe they were motivated to answer that because, they've been living with this guilt and now they feel better because they told someone, something like that. So she reported that 80% of males and 66% of females had reported extramarital affairs. That's 4 times the rate for males, and it's about 4 times the rate for females. Females tend to hover somewhere between 15 and 20% in every other survey. Now, everybody has motives to lie in that question, no matter what survey we're talking about, right? Like some people might lie and say they have had an affair when they really haven't because they don't want to seem like, boring. There might be people who say that they haven't had an affair because, they don't want people knowing and, they don't want to say it out loud. So I'm going to say that it's probably somewhat underreported is probably the more common thing. But when you see across all the other surveys hovering somewhere between 15 and 20% for females and about 20 to 25% for males, the height report is probably off. And probably we have some kind of self-selection bias that is fueling this incorrect information. That's the point I'm trying to get. All right. The last thing I wanted to say about surveys is that a lot of times people will answer in ways that they think are socially desirable rather than in ways that are accurate for them. Even when they are completely anonymous surveys. I mean, these online surveys where we send you the URL and there's absolutely no way that we could ever know that it was you particularly who said any of these things. There's still this lingering possibility that the person might want to present themselves to the researcher as having desirable characteristics or attitudes or whatever. And so they may say things that aren't actually true. A good example came in 1998 when Bill Clinton was being impeached, and they were covering it on C-SPAN, and they put it on the regular news. I think the daytime TV programming was being substituted for the impeachment trial and stuff like that. And so they would ask the, average person on the street, do you think that there's too much coverage of the impeachment trial? And the average person on the street would say, oh yeah, I mean, who needs to hear this? This is ridiculous. We just get this over with and get back to work. And they'd say all these socially desirable things. And then you look at the ratings on C-SPAN and you realize people are watching this like they're glad it's on. So, the answer that I give on the street to a person might be different from what I actually do. And you can imagine that with sexual behaviors, this is probably a really big risk, right? That people are going to say what they think is an okay thing to say rather than what is true, because they want to project themselves in a desirable way. So it's definitely tricky to do surveys of sexual behaviors, that's for sure. Well, I'm going to take a break here and come back and we'll talk about case studies and experiments in the next segment.